الفاكولتي رح يرجع على نيكل 310 مثل امبارحه لنكمل الورك شوب مع دكتور منى نبهاني، والستودنتس حيرجعوا على الغرف اللي كانوا عم يشتغلوا فيهم امبارحه على الفاينل بروجكتس. الديجيتال سكواد موجودين ليساعدوكم بالفاينل بروجكت، سو اذا عندكم اي سؤال او مش مأكدين من الموضوع فيكم تراجعوهم، فيكم تستعملوا الادوات الموجوده عندنا، والفاكولتي نحن موجودين مع دكتور منى كمان to guide you بالورك شوب. ثانك يو.
شكرا. طيب محاضرة ثانية مع دكتور جالي. هيدي my favorite lecture بالأكاديمية، وبعتقد رح تكون إحدى أحلى المحاضرات لكم كمان. دكتور جالي مرة ثانية من جامعة ماساتشوستس ومدير Media Education Foundation.
Thank you. You can see what the title of the lecture is. So in my remarks today, I wish to make a modest claim. 21st century advertising is the most powerful and sustained system of propaganda in human history. And its cumulative cultural and political effects, unless quickly checked, will be responsible for destroying the world as we know it. The principal reason for this, and the topic of my talk, is that the cultural system of advertising threatens to destroy the very thing, a sense of human connection, a sense of human community, and care for something beyond the individual that is the basis of our incredible accomplishments as a species. In the process of achieving this, the masters of the advertising system, global corporations, that actually should really, I mean, it's advertising because we're looking at the communication aspect, that should really be capitalism and the end of the world. In the process of achieving this, the masters of the advertising system, global corporations bent on nothing but private profit, will be responsible for the deaths of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of non-Western people. In addition, the people of the world will be prevented from achieving true happiness. Simply stated, our survival as a species is dependent upon minimizing the threat from commercial culture, from commercial advertising, and the commercial culture it has spawned. As I said, it's a modest claim that I want to make today. I'm stating my claims boldly at the outset, just so there can be no doubt as to what is at stake in our debates about the media and culture as we start the new millennium. So my aim today is to justify what I've just said, that what seems to be absolutely outlandish claims that I just made. The point of my lecture is to essentially convince you of that by the end of, in about a bit of an hour's time, that is actually the case. So what's the basis of these outrageous claims? Well, initially, I would just point to the incredible presence that advertising and commercial culture has in our world. Ads are everywhere. And they are colonizing, and I use the term colonizing, they're taking over. It's an imperial force taking over more and more space in the culture. That's what I mean. I use the term colonization because it's active. It's moving in, taking over, displacing other things, displacing other discourses, displacing other stories, displacing other values, and instead putting in its place the values of advertising. Let me just give you some examples, and most of these are drawn from what I know best, which is the situation in Western consumer societies, and especially the United States, the main consumer society. Almost the entire media system in the United States, television and print, has been developed as a delivery system for marketers. The prime function of media is to produce audiences for sale to advertisers. Both the ads it carries, as well as the editorial matter that's in between, as well as the programming, celebrate the consumer society. if you want to, in the United States, 100% of the income to television and radio come from advertising. We should always follow the money. If you follow the money, it'll tell you a great deal. It won't tell you everything, it will tell you a great deal. Look at the movie system. At one time, outside the direct influence of the broader marketing system, is now fully tied into the strategies of licensing tie-ins and product placements. The prime function of many Hollywood films today is to aid in the selling of things, aid in the selling of products. The most successful franchise in movie history, the last Star Wars film, which grossed about $1 billion worldwide. Those sales were, the ticket sales were 1/3 of the total merchandising sales. There was an additional $3 billion that came in from merchandising and tie-ins and trade and licensing deals. So actually the best way to think of the Star Wars film, it brings in a lot of money by itself, but it's really just a really, really long ad for all the stuff that can be bought that's ancillary to it, which is about $3 billion worth of products. And that's the function of many Hollywood ads. Hollywood films. As public funds are derived from the non-commercial sector, art galleries, museums, symphonies bid for corporate sponsorship. Even those institutions once thought to be outside of the market are being sucked in. In the United States, high schools now sell the attention of their students to advertisers and to corporations. They sell the sides of their buses to advertisers. The spaces of their hallways are sold. There are ads in the hallways of schools. There are ads in classrooms themselves. There are ads in the curriculum material that students are exposed to. There are machines in the hallway with soft drinks and candy bars, etc. There was an attempt, the Pepsi company a little while ago actually were investigating whether they could get their logo onto the moon itself. So that when you looked up at the moon, what you would see would be the Pepsi logo. It's such a waste, right? I mean, it's just open space. Why not use it for something like advertising? I mentioned yesterday what's happened with social media. Social media and Facebook and Google are the greatest advertising system ever invented. If you want to, if you want to study Facebook, if you want to study Google, if you want to study any of the big internet companies, and you do not put advertising at the center of your analysis, you will, by definition, not understand it. By definition, that doesn't care what you're interested in, but if you don't pay attention to the reason why Facebook exists, it doesn't exist so you can connect with your. That's a secondary function. The major function of Facebook is to get our attention to sell to advertisers, and the internet giants, Facebook and Google especially. Have their sights set on much broader than that. I think Moses last week in his lecture talked about something called the Internet of Things. This is a visual depiction of it. So many things now are connected to the internet. Cars, thermostats, I mean, you name it. If something has a Wi-Fi connection connected to the internet, that's what it's called, the Internet of Things. It's a network system that's not just dependent upon our mobile devices anymore. Anything that has that connection is part of the Internet of Things. And what's the reason for it? Here are a couple of news stories.
Well, the ads, they're coming. Google, in a letter to
Could we get the sound up, please?
plans to put its ads on everything from your car dashboard to your wristwatch to your refrigerator. What? You think?
Yeah, let me start again.
Will the ad?
All right.
Will the ads? They're coming. Google, in a letter to the Security and Exchange Commission, says it plans to put its ads on everything from your car dashboard to your wristwatch to your refrigerator. What? You think we're joking? We're not.
These companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon, they all want to basically control the Internet of Things so we can deliver advertising to any device.
Can you get the lights back up, please? That's the function of, they're going to deliver advertising to us 24/7. Anything that is connected to this internet is capable of delivering an ad to us. They can now put an ad on the dashboard of our car. They can put ads everywhere. That's their aim, and they put it in their documents. It should not surprise us then. Okay, that's one reason why I think advertising is so influential, because it is everywhere. It is now impossible to avoid. Impossible to avoid. It may be less so in some places, in some countries, but the logic, if it's a market economy and now in a global economy, that is the logic of what's going to happen to cultural space, to the spaces in which human beings think, to the spaces into which human beings pay attention. That attention is valuable and is going to be commodified and going to be sold. And we are well into the process of that. It shouldn't be surprising then that many commentators now identify the realm of culture as simply an adjunct to the system of production and consumption. Now, why should this be so? The answer lies, why is advertising spread everywhere? Right? That's the why is advertising taking over the culture? Why is commercial speech taking over the culture? And I'll define what I mean by culture in a few minutes. Well, the answer, of course, lies not in the power of advertising in isolation. Advertising is the voice of corporations. So it doesn't lie in the power of advertising in isolation, but in the realm of capitalist production, which has revolutionized the way that human beings interacted with the physical world around them. Indeed, no other society in human history has been able to match the immense productive output of industrial capitalism. The amount of things, the amount of stuff, the amount of commodities that can be produced by capitalism dwarfs anything that ever appeared before. And I actually think anything that will appear after this as well. And this fact, the fact that capitalism produces so much now colors the way in which the society presents itself. It colors the way in which it appears. Objects are everywhere in capitalism. In that sense, as I said, capitalism is truly a revolutionary society, dramatically altering the very landscape of social life in a way that no other form of social organization had been able to achieve in such a short period of time. In fact, in the Communist Manifesto, the manifesto written by Marx and Engels, actually when you read the Communist Manifesto, and I really urge you to read it as an analysis of capitalism, it's tough to know whether Marx and Engels are capitalism's greatest critics or capitalism's greatest fans. Because Marx and Engels they love capitalism's dynamism. They love its revolutionary character. They love the fact that capitalism was able to achieve in relatively overnight, was able to wipe away the vestiges of feudalism, which Marx and Engels saw as a necessary step to the democratic socialism that would follow. So capitalism was needed to destroy those old oppressions of feudalism. And Marx and Engels, as I said, it's tough sometimes to know whether they're his greatest critics or whether they love capitalism so much. They coined the famous phrase in the Communist Manifesto to describe capitalism's dynamism. They said, this is their phrase, about capitalism's energy and its logic, all that is solid melts into air. Actually, I think when they wrote this, they actually didn't know how right they would be. They were talking about blowing away old social relationships and feudal relationships. They actually didn't know that when capitalism, as it developed, capitalism would literally melt the solids of the planet. It would literally melt the ice caps and drown the rest of the world. That's what climate change has done. In fact, that was a phrase they use to highlight the revolutionary nature of capitalism. And that's what I want to talk about, is this revolutionary nature. It's not a conservative system. It is a dynamic, moving system that is, and then we have to say, what is it that's driving it? What value is driving it if it's changing the world in this way? In fact, what's driving it is this incredible productive apparatus, this incredibly productive capacity to make so many things. In fact, going back to when Marx wrote Capital, this is the way he starts off. This is the first lines of Capital. Actually, we don't need to turn the lights off for this. The first lines of Capital are: the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. So right at the very start, the first lines of Capital, the Marx's great economic work. Actually, if you want to understand capitalism now, you've got to go back and read Marx. And more people who are actually in the worlds of production and in worlds of finance. And Marx is now being taught again in business schools, not for his politics, but for the fact that he got the dynamism right, that he got the logic of capitalism right, that it was about labor. And he predicted globalization. He predicted why labor would move to the third world, because it would be cheap. And that was a major element of production, is human activity. In seeking to initially distinguish his object of study, what Marx refers to, as I said, is a quantitative dimension. The number of things, number of objects that human beings interact with. Now, that's capitalism's great revolutionary ability. Now, the problem, of course, is it's not only enough to produce the immense collection of commodities. That's Marx's favorite. It's a great phrase. You see, he's got quotation marks around an immense collection of commodities. He's actually quoting himself from before, because he thinks it's so important that that's the way to talk about capitalism, an immense accumulation, an immense collection of commodities. It's not only enough to produce the immense collection of commodities, of course, they must also be sold, so that further investment in production is feasible. Once produced, commodities must go through the system of distribution, exchange, and consumption, so that profit can be realized, can be returned to the owners of capital, and value can be realized again in a money form. If that circuit is not completed, production, distribution, consumption, if that system, if things are not consumed, the system dies. The system dies with overproduction. You've got too many goods and there are not enough buyers. And if capitalism didn't solve that problem, and once you've taken care of the basic needs of people, how do you get them to keep buying more and more and putting profit back into production? If that does not happen, the system would collapse into stagnation and depression. Therefore, capitalism has to ensure the sale of commodities on pain of death. Okay, and I don't want to be too dramatic about this, but unless capitalism does this as a system, it is dead. It will collapse. So on pain of death. In that sense, the problem of capitalism is not the problem of mass production, which has been solved, but in fact is the problem of consumption. So central is the consumption of products to its survival and growth, that at the end of the 19th century, industrial capitalism invents a unique new institution. This function, the ability, you've got to sell this stuff. It's so important that a new industry is invented at the end of the 19th century. that didn't exist before. And that industry is the advertising industry, to ensure that the immense collection of commodities are converted back into a money form, to ensure that the immense accumulation of commodities are sold. The function of this new industry, and it hasn't changed since its beginnings in terms of in terms of the dynamic, the function of this new industry would be to recruit the best creative talent of the society and to create a culture in which desire and identity, in which human desire and human identity would be fused with commodities. To make the dead world of things come alive with human and social possibilities. To make the dead world of things human. Again, in the first chapter of Capital, Marx does not quite talking about this, but it refers to something called the fetishism of commodities, in which commodities have to become more than just intangible objects. They become objects that express our desire and that express our identities. And indeed, there has never been a propaganda effort to match the effort of advertising in the 20th century and the 21st century. More thought, more effort, more creativity, more time and attention to detail has gone into the selling of the immense collection of commodities than any other campaign in human history to change public consciousness. Religion may give it a good run over the years, over the centuries, in terms of how much influence has gone into it. But I actually would argue that if it's been competitive in the past, it will not be in the future. I mean, one indication of this is simply the amount of money that's spent that's spent on this, and that's exponentially expanded. In the United States, over $250 billion a year alone is spent on advertising. Globally, that figure is over $629 billion. This level of concentration on information, on propaganda, is unprecedented. And these are not just, when we think about ads, they're not just like any other messages. More care and resources go into the creation of commercial messages than the stuff that surrounds them. On American television, to produce 30 seconds of commercial time costs about 10 times as much than to produce 30 seconds of programming time. The effort is the greatest stuff is in the commercials. It's not in the programs, which why programs are made so formulaic and why they all look the same. They essentially have to fill time to get our attention in the cheapest possible way. Ads have to do something different. Commercials have to do something different. They have to move us. They have to communicate with us. They have to engage us in some way so that we will go out and actually do something, like buy a product. If you wanted to compare advertising, the average ad on television to anything, the thing to compare it to would be the biggest blockbusters in Hollywood. Compare advertising to Star Wars and Jurassic Park, etc., and Transformers, because that's how much money, that's how much effort and time goes into the advertising. This discourse, and then Disney, the same. This discourse has seeped into our consciousness and our imaginations. It would be a miracle if it didn't. Right? It's taken over the culture. It is everywhere. There are huge amounts of resources expended on it. The best creative talent of the society is engaged in trying to sell us things, trying to sell us whatever it is, whether it's beer or bubblegum or pimple cream or whatever else. That's what the best creative talent of the society is engaged in. It will be a miracle. Well, it would be a miracle. It would be an impossibility that this is not going to have an effect. So the question now is to think about what is that effect. It's not a matter of questioning whether it's going to be effective. It's what is the nature of that effect. This discourse is seeped into our consciousness and our imaginations. From a diamond is forever, which is an advertising slogan invented on Madison Avenue in 1947 and has changed the way courtship happens around the world. to a world where Ronald McDonald now rivals Santa Claus in the consciousness of kids, and where the golden arches rival the Christian cross in terms of recognition. This commercial culture is the ground. It's the lens now, it's the space in which we learn to think, the lens through which we come to understand the world. And if we want to understand our world and where we're headed as a society, we had better understand this commercial environment. We had better understand what values are being pushed in this environment. Any critical theory, which is what I'm in, that's the project I'm involved in, any critical theory of modern capitalism and its cultural system, or any movement that wants to think about some kind of alternative to that does not place the analysis of the advertising system at its center, is destined to remain impotent and marginal. Now, trying to understand the power of advertising will involve us clarifying what we mean by the power and effectiveness of ads, and of asking the right question. And I think for too long now, we've asked the question, is advertising effective? But we've asked the wrong question about it. The question we've tended to ask is, we've said, does an ad campaign create demand for a particular product? That is, does an ad, does an ad for Pepsi-Cola increase sales of Pepsi-Cola? If we say it increases, if we find out it increases sales, we say, oh, well, that's effective. And if it doesn't, we say it's ineffective. That's the wrong question to ask if you're interested in the cultural role of advertising. That's an interesting question if you're Pepsi-Cola, or if you're Ford, or if you're Anheuser-Busch. That's the right question for your interest. You're interested in whether your advertising is making a difference to your market share. But it's not a particularly interesting question if you're interested in the broader cultural role of advertising. The right question to ask about advertising is, what is its cultural role? Not its role in particular campaigns, but its cultural role. What is culture? I define culture as the space, as a place where a society tells stories about itself. And every society has a cultural space. Human beings are a symbolic species. We tell stories about ourselves. We tell narratives about ourselves. That's what human identity is. That's the place of that space is what we can call culture. Culture is also where the central values of a society are articulated. Now, if you're with me so far, right, and advertising has essentially colonized that space where thinking about these things takes place, it's taken over more and more space. Its presence there is undeniable. It's really loud. It's literally loud. The ads are much louder than the programming that surrounds it. Then we have to ask, what is the central question? The question we have to ask then, a cultural question. This is the right question. If you're interested, I'm not saying some questions are, the question of does an advertising campaign increase sales for products? It's the right question if you're that company. It's the wrong question if you're a sociologist, or if you're involved in cultural studies. The right question to ask is, what are the central stories that advertising as a system spins for the society? What is the story? And actually, on the one hand, it seems like a stupid, ridiculous question to ask. There are literally millions of new ad messages produced every single day. How can we possibly ask a question that says, well, what is it that holds it? What is it that's central to it? Well, actually, I think we can. I think we can actually do that. I think there is something central to almost every single ad message. And that is, every ad tells a story about happiness. The commercial system in general tells a story about happiness. It's the consistent stories in advertising about happiness and how we should become happy. So again, it's a fundamental question. Every society has to answer that question. What is the best way to organize a society to enhance human happiness, to enhance human satisfaction, to enhance human well-being. And advertising gives a very particular answer to it. It's a story about advertising. It says the way to happiness, the way to satisfaction is through the consumption of objects through the marketplace. Commodities will make us happy. And in one very important sense, the marketplace is what will make us happy. And in one very important sense, that is the consistent and explicit message of every single message within the system of market communication. It's tough to pick a couple out, but I'll just give you, these are just a couple of examples. You could watch television in the next hour and pick out 100 of these.
1 hour, and I urge you, be on time.
Urge.
She's got the urge. Herbal, natural, botanic drugs. She's got the urge.
More than this, we're encouraged to form deep and intimate relationships with things. They don't just make us happy. We're encouraged to have relationships with things, and they become more important than human beings themselves. I'll play you 3 ads now that demonstrate this.
She's a real beauty, and she never bugs you about spending so much time with the guys. She never complains about you watching football. She thinks a little gas is a good thing. Maybe she isn't a she after all. Here's to the perfect relationship.
If you didn't hear, here's to the perfect relationship. The car doesn't complain about all those things that a real human being may complain about.
Here's how to keep it that way.
We can talk about this, baby. Don't go. Baby, I can change. I can change. Judy!
Sure gonna miss you.
Ford Explorer. Lease one for $299 a month for 24 months with $33.48 due at signing. Only from your Tri-State Quality Ford store.
Last one.
Fall in love with the rich, bold flavor, Dr. Pepper. One taste, and you get it.
Get the lights on, please. Now, he'll do anything for love. He'll go shopping for female products. He'll do the laundry. But he won't give up his Dr. Pepper. There's a limit to what love is about. So economic growth, and there's also a story told about economic growth that economic growth is good. That in fact, if happiness comes from things, then more happiness comes from more things. And therefore, the way to human happiness is to grow the economy, is to increase GDP, is to increase the quality, is to increase the standard of living, and is to bring up the standard of living for everyone. And it's justified and that notion of economic growth is justified not simply on the basis that it will provide employment. After all, a host of other things could provide employment if you wanted. But those things that are produced will make us happy. And I would argue that that's the rationale, that's the equation for the existing system of ever-increasing production told by advertising in its most compelling form. And in fact, I think it's this story that human satisfaction is intimately connected to the provisions of the market, to economic growth. That's the major motivating force for social change on a global scale as we enter the 21st century. Economic growth is good. Economic growth will bring us happiness. Now, the question that we need, again, if you looked at advertising, so I hope you're with me so far. I've made the argument that advertising is everywhere, it's really powerful, and it essentially tells one simple story about human satisfaction tied to the market and tied to goods. The question we need to pose at this stage, and the question is never asked, by the way, it's an heretical question because you can't ask it because simply the asking of it is what is heretical. The heretical question is it true? Does happiness come from material things? Do we as a society get happier as we get richer, as our standard of living increases, as we have access to more of the immense collection of commodities? Now, I understand these are complex questions, and the answers could be equally complex, but I'm going to actually cut through the complexity, and I'm going to say the general answer to that question. Is it true? Does more happiness come from more things? The answer to that question in general is no. The human happiness does not seem to be connected to the number of things that we have available to us. The evidence for this is pretty compelling. There's a lot of social scientific evidence based on surveys on this. It's been going on for a long time. In a series of surveys that started in the United States in 1945, called the Happiness Surveys, researchers sought to examine the link between material wealth and subjective happiness, and concluded that when you examine these things, both cross-culturally, between societies, as well as historically, in one society, there's a very weak correlation. I'll just do this is the data part of the analysis. So this is measuring happiness and GDP. So just let me give you quickly. On this, so the further up is the richer a society is in terms of GDP. And this is time. So it goes from 1972 to 2012 on this particular graph. This is the line that measures human happiness. And it's measured through surveys, it's measured through asking people how they feel. Do they feel very happy, not very happy, etc.? And there's been, as I said, that's the happiness surveys that have been done for a long time. And you'll notice that figure is almost stable. Does not go up or down very much. This figure here is GDP. Look at how GDP has risen. Look at how our standard in the United States, how our standard of living has risen so much. And yet it has had almost no impact whatsoever on people who regard themselves as happy. This line here is to do with well-being, and again, there's almost no change. Now, if the equation was to hold, that GDP is connected, that the economic growth is connected to happiness, we would expect this line to follow this line. This line to follow this line. We would expect an increase, and yet those figures are actually increasingly stable. We do not get any happier even as we get richer. That's what's been called, within the literature, it's called the Paradox of Affluence. Because the story says you should get happier, and we don't. And that gap actually is the paradox of affluence. Why don't more people get happier as a society gets overall richer? And there's no doubt looking at the United States, we are now a richer society than we were. The standard of living has no doubt increased, and yet the level of happiness has remained relatively stable. Why should this be so? Well, when we examine the process more closely, the conclusions, in fact, are quite intuitive. In another series of surveys called the Quality of Life surveys, people were asked about what it is they want out of life. What is it that's important in a good quality of life? What would constitute quality of life? And in general, the findings of this research indicate that if you divide the elements of satisfaction into social values, and social values are things like love, like friendship, like intimacy, like family, that's the social elements of life, and the material elements of life are to do with economic security and success. The social values outrank material values in terms of what people say makes them happy. In general, people do not, when they're asked this, they say, well, I just want a big car or a big house, whatever. They may say that and say, well, what's the big car or big house going to get you? What is it that you're after? And what comes down to is that people actually want the social elements of life. They want autonomy and control of their lives. We want to feel in control of our lives, that we are autonomous individuals. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want warm family relationships. We want tension-free leisure time. We want close and intimate friends. We want romance and love. That's actually what makes people happy. Right? That's what makes people. Like I say, it's quite intuitive. I don't think anyone would say that's nonsense. That's not to say material values are not important. Of course they are. Of course they are. But above a certain level of poverty, material things simply stop giving us the level of satisfaction that advertising says we should have. I'll give you another table. These are international comparisons. This is as society gets richer, this is GDP on this side. Sorry, no, this is GDP here. Right, so the more to the right you are, the richer you are as a society. And then this is satisfaction on this side, well-being. And what the research shows is that up until about here, this line actually should be a little bit more. It actually does make a big difference. At the lower levels of economic growth, when societies are emerging from poverty, in fact, increases in GDP make a big difference in terms of well-being. But you get to about 20,000 and it starts to level off. And the Bliss Point, that's what the researchers call it, the Bliss Point. They get that, the food reason that when people who make snack foods, who make junk food, they talk about something called a Bliss Point, which is they come up with this formula in the factory, in the laboratory, which is a mixture of sugar and other things that will just make it irresistible for people. It will make the Bliss Point. Well, the Bliss Point for satisfaction is around $36,000 GDP per capita. And after that, actually levels off and starts to go down. So it doesn't really matter how much richer we get as a society. The number of people that will be happy within that society actually are stable. And in fact, it starts to fall. And there's again a big literature on this, in the United States especially. Why the United States, the richest society there has ever existed in the history of the world. The problems are just confounding one on top of the other. Rise in the levels of depression, rise in the levels of even physical illness, rise in the level of all kinds of things. Why is that happening? Again, as I said, there's a pretty big literature about this. These conclusions point to one of the great ironies of the market system. The market is good at providing those things that can be bought and sold. That's what a market by definition is. It pushes us towards those things that can be exchanged. I'll give you this, you give me this. And the market is the central resource allocating mechanism of the society. The market, as I said, is good at providing those things that can be bought and sold, and has pushed us via advertising in that direction. And that's what advertising does. Advertising says, good things will make us happy. Things will make us happy. The marketplace will make us happy. Go to the marketplace, buy things. That is what will make us happy. But the real source, and that's the I wouldn't say it's the trick, that's the tragedy. The real sources of happiness, social relationships, are outside the capability of the marketplace to provide. The marketplace cannot provide love. The marketplace cannot provide real friendships. The marketplace cannot provide sociability. It can provide other material things and services, but they are not what makes us happy. The advertising industry, by the way, has known this since at least the 1920s. And that's when they stopped talking about things based on their material qualities alone. If we examine the advertising industry at the start, at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, you'd see that advertising talked a lot about the properties of commodities, what they did, how well they did it, how well they were made, where they were made, craftsmanship. They talked about things, about commodities. But starting around the 1920s, advertising shifts to talking about the relationship of objects, the things they have to sell, to the social life of people, which is what people want. That's the trick. They connect two things together that have nothing to do with each other. It starts to connect commodities with the powerful images of a deeply desired social life. You can leave the lights on. I'm going to play a video, but you can leave the lights on for this next part. So this is, if you look at advertising from this perspective, this is what advertising is. But forget it's about products. What are the images that advertising uses? Okay, and it's no wonder then that advertising, actually if you could leave the lights on just a little bit, it's no wonder then that advertising is so attractive to us. Advertising is so powerful, why advertising is so seductive. What it offers us are the images of the real sources of human happiness and human satisfaction. Family life, romance and love, sexuality and pleasure, friendship and sociability, leisure and relaxation, independence, control of life. That is why advertising is so powerful. That is what is real about it. The cruel illusion of advertising, this is the trick of advertising, the cruel illusion of advertising is the way that it links those things to a place that it, by definition, cannot provide it. The marketplace cannot provide love, cannot provide friendship. The falsity, you like it, lights up? I don't often quote myself, but actually I'm quoting myself here. In terms of, often people talk about advertising, that they tell us lies, etc. Well, yes, but what's the lie? If it was all lies, none of it would work. So it's got to work. There's something there that draws us in. There's something there that makes it part of our discourse. And the falsity of advertising is not in the appeals it makes, which are very real, but in the answers it provides. We want love and friendship and sexuality, and advertising points the way to it through objects. As ad executive Jerry Goodis says, he says, advertising doesn't mirror how people are acting, but how they are dreaming. Not how they're acting, but how they are dreaming. It's the dream life of the culture. It taps into our real emotions and repatches them back to us, connected to the world of things. In that sense, advertising is really like Freud's dream life. It's doing dream work. It is, actually, even saying that, it kind of simplifies a deeper process, because advertisers do more than mirror our dream life. They help to create it. They translate our desires for love, for family, for friendship, for adventure, for sex, into our dreams. In that sense, advertising is like a fantasy factory. Actually, that's the best way if I had to give another name for advertising, I would call it the fantasy factory. It manufactures our fantasies, but in a very, very real way. Taking our desire for human social contact and connecting it to something that cannot possibly deliver it, things. And all the while drawing us away from the things that can deliver it. Now, advertising's role in this, in channeling us towards these fruitless directions, is profound. That's why, actually, let me go back. I normally don't do this. Let me go back here. And that's why the difference between these two things. This is what the marketplace is delivering. It's not what we want, which is why our level of satisfaction remains level. That's the trick. That's the trick. And advertising's role within this Advertising's role within this is like, actually I called it a fantasy factory. I also think it's like a drug pusher. It's like a drug dealer on the street corner. As we try and break our addiction to things, it's there, constantly offering us another hit. As we try and break our addiction, it's there. One more ad, come on, one more time. Persistently pushing the idea of the good life being connected to products, and by colonizing every nook and cranny of the culture, where alternative ideas could be raised. Advertising is part of society that one economist called the joyless economy. This is not an economy of joy. It's an economy of comfort. It's an economy of comfort. But it is not an economy that brings us happiness. It's not an economy that brings us joy. The great political challenge, this is what's before us, the great political challenge that emerges from this is how do we connect our real desires? How do we connect them to a truly human world rather than the dead world of the immense collection of commodities? Now, what effect then does this have? This bombardment, the advertising is everywhere, huge amounts of money is expended on it. It pushes this one story about where happiness comes from. We buy into it if it's only for a moment. And as we try and cut out, even when we know it's not true, it's simply there giving us another hit. Actually, in shopping, I should stop and say, because someone says, well, shopping is fun. Right? Actually, say it is. Shopping is fun, but only for a brief moment. And that's what's fun is, what the literature shows, what gives human beings pleasure is novelty, is the new. And that's why, and you go shopping and it's new, and that's why it's exciting, right? When you first buy something, it lasts only a little while, and then within a week, it's in our closet forever. It's in our dumps. And it's like the drug pusher. If you're addicted, that's what happens. The drug gives you a high. That's why people get addicted. Right? They get addicted to the heroin, they get addicted to morphine, they get addicted to opioids. Why? Because that's the lie of the war on drugs. They never acknowledge that drugs are fun. They can be, for a brief moment. They can be fun. Except that actually then, the next time you do it, you need more to get the high. Then after a while, you can't get the high at all, and you need the drug just to remain level. And it gives you so drug addicts get no pleasure from their drug. When you see drug addicts, getting the hit, and they get no pleasure. They are back to normal. They are back to normal, and that essentially is what's, shopping can be fun. My advice to my students when I tell them this is, when you feel depressed, don't go shopping. Don't do something that's going to put something on your credit card. Raise your level of stimulation in some other way. There's lots of ways of raising your level of stimulation, doing something new. I leave it to their imagination as to what you can do that's fun over a short period of time that can raise your raise your levels of stimulation. What effect does this have then? This constant bombardment of this story into the psyches of the population. Not surprisingly, we want more and more things. We feel as though we are only defined through our relationships with objects. And that is design. That is what the industry has been. They've known that all along. This is from 1955. This is from a retail analyst called Victor Lebo. He says, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and the selling of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in commodities. We need things consumed, burnt up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing rate." You have to keep buying. You can't buy once and then have it last forever. There's more stuff coming down the line, off the production line, and so you've got to buy more. You've got to throw one away and buy the other one. Of course, this and sometimes even before a while, it's the best example of this is the iPhone. Right? There's a new iPhone every year. What's the increase? The increase is minuscule in terms of the function. The screen is much better. It's just faster by 2%. But essentially, it's the same product being and yet you're asked to buy a new product every year, so that Apple can, make its billions of dollars. And to the extent that we buy into it, we bought into it. The notion of obsolescence. Juliet Shaw, what effect does this have? Juliet Shaw, in a book, The Overspent American, delves into this obsession with goods on the lives of Americans. And what she argues is, and this is how advertising affects us, this is how the media system affects us as well when it comes to this. She argues there's been a change in the reference group to whom we compare ourselves. Human beings are a really social species. We compare ourselves constantly. We're always comparing ourselves. And in a market capitalist society, the search for status is a central aspect of how identity is formed. And she says something has changed though in the last 30 years or so. And she gives this example. I mean, actually, she does. She says our reference groups have changed. Okay, whereas in the old days, talking about the 1950s, if we were here, this is on an income scale, if that's where we were, then we would compare ourselves to the next group on the social scale. Okay, so it would be the people living on the next street or the next neighborhood, with a slightly nicer house, with a slightly nicer car, right? It'd be the Joneses down the street. It was reachable. It was reachable. And she says, what has now happened? If we are here as a result of the images flooding everywhere, the images of affluence, the lifestyles of the rich and famous everywhere, not only in the advertising but on television and movies, etc., that we now compare ourselves, to here. Our friends are now, actually that's why the show Friends is such a good title, because people think about them as their friends. Ross and Rachel and Joey and whatever else, it's a global phenomenon. They're our friends who live in this, find an apartment like that in New York where you can be unemployed and live. Right? So our friends now are not our friends who we actually have, are not our friends even who could be in the next street. Our friends are now these out-of-reach people who are in the image system, driven by advertising and the consumer culture. And we start comparing ourselves to them. That's what we want. We are a social species. We're always comparing. Okay, that's why the economic textbooks are wrong. The rational individual who thinks about their needs. And human beings are the last thing from being rational. We are always social. And we are now comparing ourselves to the very top. The aspirations of the top 20% of the population have now become the aspirations of what most people want. 85% of Americans aspire to be in the top 18% of American households. Think about that. 85% of Americans want to be in that top level. They don't have the income to be in that top level, but they want to be in that top level. That's where their aspirations are. That's where they desperately want to be. They want to be the friends of pop stars and movie stars, etc. What effect does this have? Especially as the rich keep getting richer, by the way. This starts to stretch. The rich get richer, the poorer get poorer, and so the gap becomes even a lot bigger. What effect does this have? Well, not surprisingly, if we can't afford it, we don't have the money for it, we borrow. And there's been an incredible rise in household debt, in credit card debt, and so at the moment, Americans owe over $1 trillion in credit card debt. That is $1 trillion that have been put onto credit cards for buying. Not housing is separate from that. There's another $1 trillion in housing that consumers own. So this is non-housing debt, which is debt on consumer products. That there's been a huge increase in that. And in fact, the credit card industry makes their living off this. If you have a credit card, the way credit card companies make their money is by the interest that you pay. Do you know what credit cards call people who, if you have a credit card and you put up $1,000 on a credit card and you pay the $1,000 off at the end of the month so you're not paying interest? You know what the credit card companies call you? You're a deadbeat. You're useless. They don't want you. They want the people who are going to have the interest that they want people to pay their minimum amounts of interest for the rest of their lives. They want indentured slaves who will pay a portion of their money for the rest of their lives to you. And if you don't do that, you're not a very good, if you actually pay off your interest, you're actually a very bad customer for the credit card companies. So there's an incredible rise in household debt. The number of hours people work has risen in the United States. It's gone up over 10% in the last 25 years. Millions of families have added a second earner. 25 to 30% of families. This is 60 million American families live paycheck to paycheck. They have no savings. If something were to happen to their job, they would have no 60%. That's almost a quarter of the population. Have no savings to fall back on. Personal bankruptcies are at historic levels. The national savings rate has plummeted. I mean, in terms of the United States, everyone else in the world saves much more than Americans do. And that's why 60% of America, those 60 million Americans who could not sustain themselves because they have no savings. All they have is debt. It's also affected what we can call the public purse and collective consumption. People don't want to pay more taxes. They don't want to pay for the services, the social services, because that's not part of who they are. So this value system has loosened the bonds between individuals and the community, so that people are now less connected to each other. There's a really good book on this, a classic book on this, written by a sociologist called Robert Putnam. The book is called Bowling Alone. And it's an analysis, it's a bowling, he's talking about bowling as 10-pin bowling they have in. And he says, actually the same amount of Americans bowl as they used to bowl in the 50s, but now they bowl alone. Whereas in the 50s they used to bowl with families and with friends, and there used to be leagues, community leagues, where so bowling was a community effort. Nowadays it's become an individual effort. We care less about society. That's what the advertising system says. Don't worry about society, worry about yourself. Worry about yourself. Worry about your own individual needs and desires. In fact, commercial culture tells us there's no such thing as society. There's no way there's nothing that holds us together in any kind of collective way. There's nothing that we share. There's nothing that we share that is common between us. That's what I mean by society. Society means, what is it that holds us together? Is there a common core of values and culture? Then advertising says, no, there's nothing like that. In fact, capitalism says there's nothing like that. In fact, that idea has been reinforced in the realm in the sphere of politics in the last 35 years by the rise of neoliberalism. And that's why neoliberalism is the extreme version of a fetishism of the market. It's the political expression of an unregulated market system. In fact, Margaret Thatcher, she was British Prime Minister in the 1980s. She says, and she was not misquoted, she said this. She said, "There is no such thing as society. There are just individuals and their families. There is nothing that holds us together as a society. There's nothing that holds us together. Nothing we can call society. No group values, no collective interest. Society is just a bunch of individuals acting on their own." And in fact, that's exactly how advertising talks to us. It talks to us as individuals. It does not address us as members of society talking about collective issues. It talks about our individual needs and desires. It does not talk about those things we have to negotiate collectively. There are things we can only negotiate collectively. It does not talk about things like poverty. It does not talk about things like, actually the United States is really weird when it comes to healthcare in terms of not being able to talk about it in a collective way. It talks only about it in an individual way. It does not talk about housing. It does not talk about the homeless. It can't. The market cannot talk about climate change. The market cannot talk about nuclear proliferation. That's outside of the realm of the market. The major things that actually could destroy us, it cannot talk about. It only talks to us individually about. It talks to us, you as an individual, about your needs now. In that sense, the market appeals to the worst in us. It appeals to greed, it appeals to selfishness, and discourages what is the best about us. Discourages compassion and caring and generosity. They have no place within the realm. The marketplace doesn't know how to deal with. How do you commodify compassion? How do you commodify caring? It's the wrong system. If that's what you want to care about, a market would not be the institution you would use to try and regulate a society that is a compassionate society or a caring society. It's not the fault of the market. That's not what it does. It's not what it's designed to do. You can't complain about it that it doesn't. That's not. But once you install it at the center of a society, and once you install its propaganda everywhere in the culture, then those collective issues are going to be sidelined. Again, I want to say this should not surprise us. In societies where the marketplace dominates, then what will be stressed will be what the marketplace can deliver. And so discussions of collective issues are pushed to the margins of the culture. They're not there at the center of the culture. As I said, it's no accident that politically the market vision associated with neoconservatives and with neoliberalism, and I got Margaret Thatcher up here because she was one of the key architects of neoliberalism in the 1980s, along with, it wasn't not individuals, it's a system. But Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were the kind of the visual embodiment of neoliberalism in the 1980s. It's no accident the market vision associated with neoliberalism and neoconservatism has come to dominate at exactly that time when advertising has been pushing the same values into every available space in the culture. That's not an accident. Those two things happen at the same time. The widespread disillusionment in the United States, government is a dirty word. Talk about government, which is, yes, the government can be taken over by, forces that might not be great, but as far as I know, it's the only institution that we have which is a collective institution that deals with collective issues. It's supposed to deal with collective issues. And in the United States, government has been labeled as the problem, not the solution. Unfortunately, we're now in a situation, both globally and domestically, where solutions to pressing nuclear environmental problems will have to take a collective form. The marketplace cannot deal with the problems that face us at the start of the new millennium. It cannot deal with the threat of nuclear extermination that is still with us in the post-Cold War age. It cannot deal with climate change. It cannot deal with the depletion of non-renewable resources. The effects of the way we do business are no longer localized, they are now global, and we will have to have international and collective ways of dealing with them. Individual action is no longer enough. Human beings, this is what we've done, is we've changed. Okay, I won't put it back up, but remember Marx and Engels? All that is solid melts into air. We have changed the very nature, the geological nature of the world in 50 years. Such and such, the geologists now say we are now living in a new geological period called the Anthropocene, which is the age of humans, in which human activity, when the dinosaurs went, it was a meteor from space that did it. We've done this ourselves. And we've done the consumer capitalism has done it, and it's done it since 1950. That's an incredibly short period of time. Now, we have to take, this is the part of the problem now. We actually, I think, are starting to see it. We have to take action now to save the planet in the future. When I used to give this lecture, actually, I've been giving it for a long while, but when I gave it, even 10 years ago, climate change wasn't quite apparent yet. You could look at data, you could look at charts, etc. And I used to frame it in such a way that, well, we've got a little bit of time, but we have to we have to change very soon. We're actually in the crisis now. The crisis has already started, and we know we are feeling the worst effects of it. The 10 hottest years on record in the history of the planet since we started taking this happened since 1998. I mean, even conservatives in the US are now starting to realize something is wrong when it comes to climate. We have to take action, and we cannot do this individually. We have to do it collectively. We have to find the political will somehow to deal with a world, to save a world after we're dead. We have to take action now, and we have to make short-term sacrifices now to save the world in the future. We have to link to that. We have to link to that world. 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, as in the old Native American philosophy, 7 generations down the road. How do we do that? How do we identify with our next generation? As Robert Heilbronner, the political philosopher, and he put this was 20 years ago, he said, there are many who would sacrifice much for their children. Fewer would do so for their grandchildren. And yet we've got to make those bonds with the future. And the context within which we are going to do it, which we have to do that, is the context provided by commercial culture, is the context provided by advertising. We have to think about those issues. We have to think about nuclear extermination. We have to think about climate change. We have to think about those I'm going to give you a challenge now. I want to play something now, and your job is not to look there, your job is to look at me. And I'm going to tell you it's difficult because there's going to be some really fun images on there. There are going to be real images of and I know there are images of desire and pleasure because that's what they're drawn from advertising. You can't look there. The future of the world depends on it. The future of the world doesn't depend on me, but the future of the world depends on the issues that I'm dealing with. No, you have to look here. That's the ground. That's the ground now on which we will be. Could you just leave the lights on me, please? That's the ground on which we will have to think about. Yeah, I'm losing this battle, I can see. People they're trying to do it by putting things up in front of their eyes or whatever. No, you can't do that. You gotta look here. You can't close your eyes. You gotta look this way. And why am I doing this? That's the ground on which we're going to have to think about these problems. That's the lens through which we have to think about the future. That's the context. That's what's in our heads. The time frame of advertising is now. Why would you look here when you can look at there? Why would you look here when the pleasure and the fun is there? Why would you think about climate change and nuclear extermination when the fun is all there? And that's the challenge that we have. That's a challenge that we have. And as advertising is going to, as it develops, those things are going to get even worse. They're going to get more and more intense. And we're going to be appealed to in deeply emotional ways. Actually, I'm going to stop this right now. In deeply emotional ways. Yeah, with what though? You get the lights off? And turn the power on, turn the sound up? I'm going to play you that again, actually. Could we get the sound up?
Bro, you see that?
What?
The first time I saw this ad, I actually thought it was real. I was watching it, I was watching some sports event or something on television, and I thought I was watching a real piece of video. My heart was pumping. Right? It's just so powerful that truck is going to survive a meteor hitting it. And when I first saw it, it was impossible not to look at it. It was impossible not to feel. It was impossible for your heart not to thump. It was impossible. That's what's coming as the competition for our attention gets more and more competitive, because these corporations are also in competition with each other for our attention. And as they do that, then okay, it's going to be a losing battle. I mean, this doesn't have any. You can leave the lights on this. There's something called neuroscience now happening. They're using neuroscience, and so they're hooking people up. As you can see here, they're putting things that can measure brain waves and brain activity. And then they're putting that, and what are they doing with this? What are they experimenting with? They're putting it in front of an ad. And this is the brain over here, reacting to stimuli. The brain acting without, it's not thought. We're not thinking. This is the brain acting without, acting on its own. It's the emotional content of it. We have no chance. We have no chance. Which is, I get really, when people talk about how our consumers are so empowered because they can make their own meaning of ads, and it's like, are you kidding me? There's $50 billion worth of research on the other side against one individual. You think that's a fair battle? When people say, well, the exposure the kids have to advertising, that's parents' fault. That's parents' responsibility. Are you kidding me? I did another film about kids and advertising, and I talked to an MBA. There's an MBA person who talked to me and said, think about it. There's a 2-year-old child, and there's 50 MBAs on the other side of that screen, and they're coming up with ways to get to that 2-year-old child. You think that's fair? You're telling parents it's up to them to be able to. It really, as you can say, annoys me a little bit. The value of a collective social future is one that does not and will not find expression with our commercially dominated culture. Instead, the prevailing values provide no incentive to develop bonds with future generations. And there's a real sense of nihilism and despair about the future, and a closing of ranks against the outside. Part of this is we recognize the end of the world is coming. It's impossible not to. And what's the answer that advertising gives? Party like it's the end of the world. Oh, sorry, I thought I had an ad here. I don't have an ad. Okay. So I'll describe an ad. There's a new ad that I just saw. It's by a beer company, and it's literally the end of the world. The newscaster says the end of the world is coming. There's hurricanes and tornadoes coming, and the buildings are being ripped apart. And it's a beer commercial. And as this is happening, a guy walks up to a jukebox and presses a jukebox, and there's an Elvis Presley song starts to play. And as the world is collapsing, he and a woman are dancing together. As the world, that's the image. It's nihilism. And then the tagline on the whole ad is, "Tomorrow is exaggerated." Tomorrow is exaggerated. Why worry about tomorrow when you can have fun now? And that's the context within which we have to think about how we have to think about the future. So when I started off, when I said advertising and the end of the world, I know you all thought he's crazy. It's a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. I actually think that advertising and the commercial culture is connected to what we can do, to how we can think, to our imaginations, because we need imaginations. As Frederick Jameson says on this, the cultural critic, he remarks, and I think it's true, he says, it's far easier for people to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. It's easier we don't have imaginations to imagine a different world than what advertising shows us what capitalism is. And I think he's right. It's easier for people to imagine. And there's a lot of end-of-world scenarios. All those zombie films and zombie programs, that's what that is. Right? There's lots of these end of the world. All the superhero stuff. All right, that's what it's going to require. Not individual. I mean, the superhero stuff is, it's Nietzsche, Superman gone nuts. Right? The people will save us. It's not going to be ordinary people. It's not going to be what you and I do. It's not going to be the collective decisions that citizens make together, collectively. But it's going to be these superhuman people who are battling the evil in the world. Leave it up to the experts. Leave it up to go back to your own little worlds. You can't do anything. Well, as I said, the zombie films, the world is already ended. We have to find an alternative response. The alternative is to work for humane, collective, long-term values, and that will require an effort of the most incredible kind. That's the great political challenge as we're into the 21st century now. How do we fight against this system of values, and how do we articulate an alternative that draws people in? The first thing to do is we have to understand it. I'm going to go with this. Is some of you may have heard of is an Italian socialist called Antonio Gramsci. He was imprisoned by Mussolini because he was too dangerous to be left out because of his political philosophizing. And Gramsci has changed in terms of how we want to think about the development of alternative social movements in the future. Gramsci is absolutely key to that. And his phrase was pessimism. One of his phrases was pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Now, one of the things that happens I'm often accused of being, people often say, my students used to say, that my analysis would kind of paralyze them. That it would all be doom and gloom. It'd be too much pessimism of the intellect. Right? That pessimism of the intellect, if you do your analysis properly, we are going to be depressed. But if you want to change the world, you better know what the world looks like. You better know everything about the world, even if it depresses you. And that's the optimism of the will. To get to the optimism of the will, to get to the change, you've got to do the analysis. This is one of the people that's really been influential on my work and on my life is the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, the British cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who died a couple of years ago. Stuart Hall, although he never liked to say it himself, he invented cultural studies at the university, and the work that he and his colleagues did at the University of Birmingham in the 1970s. And this is Hall talking about Gramsci. Can we get the sound up, please?
Gramsci used to say, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. What he meant is, understand how the bloody system works. What confronts you? The fact that the terrain is not favorable to your project. Understand that, even if it disillusions you, even if it makes you awake at night. Understand it. Then you're in a position to say, well, what can change? Where are the emergent forces? Where are the cracks and the contradictions? What are the elements in popular consciousness one could mobilize for a different political program?
He says, understand the bloody system. Right? Understand it first. Why do you have to understand it? Not to depress you. He says it may depress you, may make you keep you up at night. But do the analysis, do the intellectual work of understanding the system in its complexity. Then you know where the weaknesses are. Then you know who you can make alliances with. Then you know who your friends are. You know who your enemies are. You can think about strategy. I think there's an over kind of fetishization of activism these days. And activism is really important, but if activism doesn't have something behind it, it will be absolutely useless. It will be absolutely useless. Unless you have the pessimism of the intellect, the optimism of the will not even be possible. And Hall spent his entire life trying to get us to understand that distinction, or to understand that we have to have both of those things. And unfortunately, we didn't really listen to him. Over 100 years ago, Marx observed that there were two directions that capitalism could take: towards a democratic socialism or towards a brutal barbarism. That was the choices he gave in 100 years ago. Socialism or barbarism. I think it's impossible to look at the world and think that we're not really close to barbarism these days. And as we start the 21st century, I think those choices have never been starker. And I hope I've made it clear why we need to understand it if we want to move forward in any kind of productive way. Thank you. So is someone handling the mics?
Thank you. ما عرفتش نحكي بالعربي ولا لا. très difficile. d'accord, نحكي بالعربي.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in Arabic.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. شكرا ساعة على المحاضرة. نحب فات نحكي.
I think we've got, try now.
Okay.
Yes, I can, yeah.
حبيت نحكي على علاقة الإشهار بالكابيتاليزم وعلاقة هذا كل بالصحافة. يعني وقت اللي نشوفوا مثال، فما كتاب قريته مؤخرا على كابيتاليزم ديزير سيرفيتود، كاتب فيلسوف فرنسي يحكي كيفاش الإشهار، دور الإشهار في تقليص الفارق بين يعني ديزير رغبة الكابيتاليست أو رأس المال وسعادة الإنسان، في أنه يعني يخلق الموديل هذايا بتاع المجتمع حتى في علاقة الإنسان بالشغل. اليوم نحن في مجتمع يعتبر أنه الفرد اللي ماهوش مش productive خارج عن المنظومة، و يعني معناها إنسان باش نقولوا غير مرغوب فيه اجتماعيا. وفي باش نوصل للعلاقة مع الصحافة، مع يعني في الواقع وقت اللي نخدموا على مشاكل اجتماعية، على الفقر أو على البطالة أو على يعني أصناف كما البطالة تحديدا، دائما نرجع إلى التعريفات نتاع الكابيتاليزم للإنسان اللي غير يعني كيفاش نقولوا برودكتيف. دونك حبيت نعرف من عندك معناتها كيفاش تشوف تفسر أكثر علاقة الصحفي، معناتها كيفاش الصحفي نجم يبدل النظرة هذه أو يعالج مسائل متعلقة بالكابيتاليزم بالمسائل.
Actually, let me do it because that was quite a long. I got it. I mean, it's the role of. I mean, I think for journalists, it's the role of whether you're an independent journalist or not, and whether you have that distance from the things that you're reporting about. And I think I mean, the way journalism is. I mean, I'll talk about the situation I know best, which is the United States. Journalism has essentially collapsed in the United States as a result of the lack of resources that are going into it, and public relations, etc., that are pushing journalists to just reproduce news. That doesn't mean that there isn't great journalism being done, but it's being done, I think, outside of those major media institutions. It's got to be done in independent media, which by necessity means you're not going to get that audience. But you can also then, and there are in the United States, I mean in the rest of the world, there are, I think journalism is in real trouble. I think there are great journalists. And the great journalists are the ones who insist upon the notion of independence and still insist upon the notion of that the role of journalism is not to be objective, which is to present both sides, but to tell the truth. And if you do that, then as long as that's what's guiding you, I don't think you're going to get very far in mainstream places, because I think the notion of journalism has changed. That if you, as you said, if you have a story about unemployment, you may have experts on unemployment from a left-wing perspective. You may even have interviews with people who are unemployed or with the homeless. But your editor's going to say, but where's the alternative voice? We have to talk to someone in business, right? And I think that's the notion of journalism that is about reproducing what's already out there. And the question is getting to the truth. And so if you can, and I said, I don't think that's going to happen within the confines of mainstream journalism. It's got to happen outside. But I think there are those places. I think the internet gives us some roles, some ways of being able to do that. I think it's also up to the public to be able to support journalism in that way. We have to pay for alternative sources. We're so used to not paying. But we've got to, if you would like a particular media source, an alternative media source, you can't just listen to it, you've got to support it, so that the work of independent journalists is actually made possible, because that takes money and it takes resources. And so my answer to you is a complicated answer. I don't think it's just the responsibility of journalists. I think it's the responsibility of those social movements who are looking for a different future to be able to sustain an alternative realm where that kind of work can be possible. And I think, and that's one of the ways to doing that is, but that's why you've got to be clear about what's here. And I think once people are clear about what's there, then they know that the alternative, that there has to be some kind of alternative. One of the things I'd say it's very unpopular when I say this, but I tell people, I'm not sure about in this context, but in the United States, I said, look, you must probably spend $200 a month every month, giving your money to corporate sources. You give it to a cable company, you give it to your broadband, you give it to, right? And so if you're really interested in supporting independent journalism, you have to support independent journalism to the same extent as you support corporate journalism. So if you spend $200 a month on your cable subscription, you've got to spend $200 a month supporting supporting independent journalism. You've got to give $50 a month to Democracy Now! Or to the Real News Network, or to a host of, or to the Intercept. But the Intercept doesn't need it, but other places. You've got to do that, and that's the only way you can then provide the resources that's going to allow a different type of journalism. Very long answer.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Hi, thank you very much for your talk, this inspiring talk. And as a neo-Marxist and from the feminist critical standpoint, I cannot help but have to comment, of course, on your examples that you gave that show so wonderfully how capitalism and the patriarchal system is intertwined and is interlinked. Because as we have seen, there is the women's body is being conveyed as an object that you can buy, that and is actually being placed at the same level as something that is to be sold out. So it's very interesting to read also like critical theory coming from feminist perspectives on these issues. And the second is a question, like besides this comment, I have a question. You were talking about the climate change and that it cannot be like really marketized in that way, but what do you think about the new like bio products and fair trade? Isn't that also a way of how to individualize this kind of issues and and make it market compatible in that way? Thank you.
Do you want to take another question, or should I answer that? Or?
بدي أسأل سؤال بس. بشكل سريع بس بدي أسأل إنه هل الإعلانات دائما بتكون مؤثرة؟ أنا بشتغل في مجال التسويق وبشوف إنه بعض مرات بعض السلع بتكون مطلوبة من غير ما نقدم هاي الإعلانات الكبيرة أو من غير ما نقدم لها إعلانات، في المقابل بتكون في سلع كل يعني بيكون شغل التسويق لها كامل ومن بجانب الإعلانات ومقدم كافة الإعلانات بس ما بتكون مطلوبة. السؤال إنه هل لأنه الإعلانات دائما بتكون مؤثرة على الجانب سواء السيكولوجي أو الجوانب الأخرى اللي ممكن تقنع الفرد بأنه يقتنع بسلعة معينة؟
One more?
At the beginning, you said that at the end of the 19th century, a new industry in here.
Sorry.
A new industry has invented, it was the advertising industry. But what about the phenomena of advertising? I think it's really ancient from the beginning of the drum beater, those who were shouting near the ship for the goods. My second question is about the end of the war. If we imagine that advertising, while it makes the commercial job, also including, and it's imaginary, including a message of culture, helping people to learn things are good for them, for their behaviors. Would it lead also to the end of the war?
Okay, so let me take those. The first one was about issues around gender and feminism to start off with. Absolutely. I mean, I've got lots of other films on on those issues. But one of the things I've learned as both as a teacher and a filmmaker is you've got to kind of focus in on your main topic without ignoring everything else. And so, yeah, I mean, you can't include everything, but as I said, there are lots of other films that do those other things. In terms of your second point about fair trade, I think that's the right. There is a rising awareness, right, among people, among certain sectors of the population about ethical trading. There's a movement, towards renewable resources and green energy, etc. And so I don't want to. I guess for the sake of in an hour, I wanted to talk about the one side, but I kind of see this as a kind of race. There's more and more. Actually, I have in my house in the States, I have solar panels on my house, and I know recently that Germany operated for one day on nothing but alternative energy. Right? So I mean, these are rising. So the two, I kind of think of it, look at it as a kind of graph on you know, through history. Is that these two things are rising, these two kind of understandings. And will our understanding around these alternative energy sources and these alternative ways, will it come fast enough before the end, before it's kind of essentially a point of, you know, of no return? And there will be a point of no return around climate change. And so I've framed it in this way because I think this is the dominant thing that's happening. But there is also, as you say, there are also alternative movements around global fair trade, around alternative energies, around other ways of being. And the question is, which of those, as they go up, are there going to be enough people? Is the progressive vision going to be powerful enough to be able to come mainstream, not just on the margins? It's always going to be, you know, being on the margins is, you know, that's kind of relatively easy to do. But is it at some point, when will it become the mainstream? And that's the battle. That's the battle of imagination. That's the battle that we have to have imagination that says this alternative way of thinking about the world is going to be better for the end. It's better for the world. It's also going to be fun. It's also going to be pleasurable. It's also going to be, like, you're not just doing it because of duty, but you're going to do it because it actually feels good. And it is good, and the pleasure is going to be more than the fleeting pleasures you see on the screen there. The pleasures are going to be real and deep lasting. So you've got to talk about those pleasures as well. And I think the left has not been very good at talking about alternative pleasures. And I think we have to be able to talk about those alternative pleasures as well. Whether we can do it in time or not, that's the battle. That's the future, that's history. I hope we can. I think we all have a role to play. I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to see, you know, where it's going to end, but I know that if I don't do what I'm supposed to do now, there's no possibility of change in the next. And so you have to have a kind of long view of history. Sorry, the second one was about, marketing as an ecosystem. Is it always effective? Well, yes, no. Right, but though in individual campaigns, this campaign is effective, and sometimes, you know, in the United States, I don't know if it became a global campaign, but, you know, Coke had this campaign with one of the Kardashians, right, where there's a protest taking place, and she joins the protest, and she gives Pepsi. Sorry, that shows how much and she gives Pepsi to one of the soldiers. And there was outright condemnation of it, you know, kind of across the board. And so clearly, you know, marketing, people make mistakes. And in one sense, because marketing is, you know, the people who are in marketing, it's so kind of male-oriented that it's their fantasies and their ideas that become, and sometimes it doesn't match up with where public consciousness is. And so within that, some things are going to work and other things are not. As I said, I think that's the wrong question to ask. My question would not be whether this is effective or that's effective, but it's to look at, even in that, you know, the Pepsi ad with Kylie Kardashian, or whichever one it was, right? It's still, within that, Coke is the central thing. That it's the commodity that's still central to it. So even in the stuff that doesn't work, can we form some kind of alternative to that? That's, you know, that I think is the right question. The other one was about that, you know, has advertising always been around? Communication has always been around. There's always been we are a communicating species, right? And so it's not a matter. And although I said advertising, you know, I try and make it you know, commercial advertising about products. And certainly the skills that people have, if we wanted to go back to, for example, the first Obama campaign in 2008 when he won, and there was this incredible energy around Obama, a lot of the people in advertising who were taken by Obama made these incredible messages for free that they put on the web about Obama, and they were incredibly emotional. I'm sure they played a huge role in getting Obama elected. So it's about where the creativity is used. Can you use the creativity in social marketing campaigns? Of course you can. Right? But the campaign there, the attempt there is not to sell products. So it's not about, it's not about communication being bad or about 30-second messages being bad or about, about advertising being bad. It's what it's used for and what its function is. And if you change the context, absolutely it can be used in a different way. What's different though, as I said, about modern context as opposed to the past context, is that there was never an industry that was devoted only to advertising. I mean, if you had advertising, if you had someone giving information about their product, it was their information about their product in the marketplace. And so I think the specialization of it is what makes it different. Sorry, what was the other one? I can't actually read my own handwriting. Oh, sorry, I think that was the 4. Sorry, that was the question.
Sorry, we're really out of time. I'm really sorry, Jane. Maybe you can talk to him afterwards. Thank you, Seth, so much for your lecture. بس حابة أذكركم إنه بما إنه تأخرنا شوي بالمحاضرة حنبلش الوركشوبس على الساعة 2. الفاكولتي بنيكل هول 310 مثل امبارحة والستودنتس بالقاعات اللي كانوا عم يشتغلوا فيها.